For more than a century, the European bison stood in the books as the last unbroken thread of an ancient wild. The wisent, as it was called, was supposed to be the mirror image of the steppe bison that once thundered across the Pleistocene grasslands, a single lineage, only thinner in number, but genealogically clean. Next to it, the American bison took its own place on the family tree, drawn by naturalists as a near cousin, a branch that wandered across Beringia during the Ice Ages and rerouted itself on the plains. The story was tidy. 2 animals. 2 continents. 1 continuous line. Now take that picture and try to hold on to it, because it does not survive what the bones have said. What makes the bison story unusual is not just that it is old. Plenty of animals are old. What makes it strange is that the animal itself refuses to behave like a settled fact. The European bison, the one that survived in the forests of Bialowieza and was painstakingly rebuilt after World War I, has never quite matched the body of a typical bison. Its horns curve differently. Its hump sits lower. Its posture is lighter. Hunters who met it in the 18th and 19th centuries called it half-bull. And when scientists began to look closely at the bones preserved in European caves, frozen in permafrost, and finally pulled into laboratories where ancient DNA could actually be read, the animal stopped looking like a single thing at all. Here is the first question to hold: if bison are not what we were told, then what actually walked the European steppe before us? The accepted history had a clean central figure, a heavy, woolly steppe bison that paleontologists had named Bison priscus. It was supposed to be the root of everything: the giant horned animals of the Pleistocene, the wisent of Europe's forests, and, across the Bering Land Bridge, the ancestor of every American bison as well. It was a comfortable story, and it fit thousands of well-documented bones. For most of the 20th century, no one really needed to question it. Then in 2016, a team led by Julian Subrier, working with colleagues in Australia and across Europe, published a study in Nature Communications that quietly rearranged the trunk of the tree. They had recovered complete mitochondrial genomes from ancient European bison specimens, and then surveyed nuclear DNA across enough sites in the genome to get something more honest than a single maternal line. The mitochondrial signal in European bison was not steppe bison at all. It was aurochs. The mother line came from Bos primigenius, the great wild ox that once grazed across the temperate forests of pre-agricultural Europe. The father line came from the steppe bison. And this was not a recent event, some curious interbreeding in the last few thousand years. The genetic separation ran deep. The hybridization that produced the wisent could be traced back more than 120,000 years. That is when the phrase Higgs boson, borrowed from particle physics by one of the researchers who initially championed the cave art evidence, was quietly rebranded in the press as Higgs bison. The animal had been predicted before it was confirmed. People had seen it in the paintings. Cave art is an unusual line of evidence. It can be fanciful. It can be symbolic. But European Upper Paleolithic artists were also acute naturalists, and across dozens of painted caves in France and Spain the bison they drew on the walls do not always look like ordinary bison. Some have shorter, more curved horns, a long dorsal mane, a forward-leaning hump, and a build that more closely resembles cattle. For decades, paleontologists had argued whether these were stylized images, regional variants, or something else entirely. Margomedon, Chauvet, the painted ceilings of Lascaux, the strangeness in those shapes kept accumulating. When ancient DNA finally caught up to the caves, the strange shapes stopped being artistic license. The animals the artists had drawn were real animals. The painted form was, in effect, the visual signature of a hybrid clade that had no right to exist, and yet had been reproducing in Europe for tens of thousands of years. Cave art had been keeping a record of a lineage that the bones alone could not fully explain, because the bones had been sorted, measured, and forced into the wrong category for more than 100 years. So here is where the picture begins to widen, and this is where the second question belongs, because the answer cannot be rushed. If even the wisent is a hybrid, carried into the modern world by surviving refuge populations in the Caucasus and Bialowieza, then what does the word species actually mean when we use it for animals like these? The honest answer is that the word was borrowed from a kind of science that did not know about gene flow across deep time. Modern genetics has spent the last 2 decades showing, with bison, with bears, with canids, with humans themselves, that evolutionary lines are not trees drawn in clean branches. They are braided. They are stitched. They are sometimes torn and restarted. The wisent is not a lesser bison. The wisent is a draft of evolution that was never finished, a population that came into being through a single ancient cross and then kept going on its own terms. It is not a species the way the wolf is a species. It is closer to a long-running experiment. Across the Atlantic, the story gets no simpler, only older. For a long time, The giant-horned bison latifrons of the American Pleistocene was treated as a kind of evolutionary preamble, a starter form that gradually shrunk and rearranged itself into Bison antiquus, which then became Bison bison, the form that survived excavation and reintroduction in the plains. Bones told most of this story. Chronology told some of it. Mitochondrial DNA from permafrost and cave specimens filled in the rest. The reconstructions by Beth Shapiro and colleagues, beginning around 2004, together with the radiocarbon work that followed, showed that steppe bison first moved across Beringia sometime between roughly 195,000 and 135,000 years ago. They were abundant, extraordinarily abundant, the dominant large herbivore across much of Pleistocene North America. And then, in waves that matched the climate, their populations crashed and boomed again, taking genetic diversity with them each time. Far more of what we see in the American bison today is not an unbroken legacy. It is the residue of a few narrow genetic windows. That is the part that should linger with the viewer, because it reframes what an American bison actually is on the landscape. The herd thundering across Yellowstone or grazing in Wind Cave is not a museum exhibit of a Pleistocene giant. It is what is left of a lineage that nearly disappeared, then re-emerged from a much smaller genetic pool than the one that originally crossed the land bridge. And the bones buried in the permafrost, the ones that have been sampled for ancient DNA across Alaska and the Yukon, reveal a population turnover that Darwin would have recognized, a creature continually remade by what the climate allowed to survive. This is where the paradox closes on itself, and where the second question earns its answer. If the wisent is a hybrid, and the American bison is a survivor of ancient bottlenecks, and if we go back far enough the entire bison family turns out to be a stitched lineage of intercontinental crossings, climate contractions, and reproductive accidents that nevertheless kept working, then the species concept, as we casually use it, is the wrong instrument. Bison are not a tidy tree. They are not a clean line of descent that someone can sketch on a single page. They are a continuously corrected draft of what nature was willing to keep standing. Their horns, their humps, their short tails, their seasonal migrations, all of it is a working compromise, not a finished design. This matters now, in the present. Conservation of the wisent cannot be guided by the assumption that it is a pure remnant. It is a hybrid, and any serious breeding program has to acknowledge that it carries two genetic ancestries at once. The American bison, likewise, cannot be managed as if it were a uniform wild type. Some herds show cattle introgression. Some do not. Some preserve mitochondrial lines that reach back into Bison antiquus. Others carry signatures of more recent collapses. Knowing that bison are not what the older story said is not trivia. It is the basis on which their protection will either succeed or quietly fail. Take a last look at the image we began with. A bison on the prairie, a bison in the forest, both enormous, both seemingly eternal. That picture is real, but it is no longer stable. Behind it lies a Higgs bison painted on a wall, waiting 12,000 years to be proven. Behind it lies a steppe crossing that almost succeeded in reverse. Behind it lies the quiet mathematical fact that the family these animals belong to is not a tree but a braid, woven by cold climates, by chance matings, by ice, by retreat, by recovery. Bison are not a species in the simple sense. They are a long, unfinished negotiation between two parent lines and the world that keeps putting pressure on them. To stand in front of one now is to stand in front of an evolutionary document, one that is still being written, and that, perhaps, is the only honest definition left. If this kind of origin matters to you, consider following along as more of these rewritings come to light.